or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." Then he told them this parable. "The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' Then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there will be a place for me to store my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?'" Jesus goes on to say, "This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God." Okay, so now that we've covered this parable, let's look at number 1. Who would we say are the main character or characters in this parable? Well, it seems that there's only 2 people, or 2 identities. There is this man, and then there's God. So we've identified the main characters, and in this situation, it's pretty straightforward. This man is anyone, could be me, could be you, any one of us who lives in the world and needs to deal with worldly possessions. Then, of course, God is God. He's not something different. This is an easy one, but in other parables you may find that something like soil actually represents a heart condition. Or when Jesus talks about 2 men that were forgiven, one forgiven a little, one forgiven much, the Pharisee and the sinful woman that Jesus was actually talking to should have identified as each of those characters. So sometimes we need to determine who the characters represent, and other times it's straightforward, as in this case. Now, number 2 is to determine the topic that receives the most attention. This is likely the key or main point. In this situation, it seems very clear that Jesus is talking about possessions and how to live in this life with possessions. In this case, the man is storing and building and storing some more and building some more and having more for himself. And so we see possessions and selfishness played in as the key topic here. Number 3, we need to study the direct dialogue, if there is any. This usually shows the emphasis of the parable. And so combined with number 2, as we look at what topic is talked over and over again, what is the dialogue saying back and forth? Well, we have 2 sets of dialogue. The first is the man just talking to himself as he thinks to himself, well, I've built up so many good things, I just don't have any room for them. What will I do? Well, I will just build bigger, and then I can take life easy and eat, drink, and be merry. So, what can we show from that as part of the emphasis of this parable? Well, we can see that the man is first good at building up possessions for himself, but also that his inner monologue is selfish. So we see, again, possessions and selfishness. Then God comes in and gives a dialogue to the man by calling him a fool and telling him that this very night his life will be demanded of him, and then who's going to get all those possessions that he was selfishly hoarding for himself. So again, it settles on the emphasis of possessions and selfishness. Then number 4, look to the end for the main point and words like so, therefore, and but. In this case, Jesus says, this is how it will be with anyone who has possessions and has not been generous toward God. So what's the main point? Again, we come back to possessions and selfishness versus selflessness or generosity. Number 5, look for the unexpected surprise or twist in the story. This is often key to understanding. Now, many of us in the West would look at what this man's doing and we would say, this is a wise man. He's being very smart. He's worked hard and now he's saving. He's getting ready for retirement. It's good to be prepared. And so if I'm listening to this parable and I hear what this man's saying, I might begin to agree with him and say, yes, these are good things. But then the twist comes in this situation when God speaks and gives God's perspective, which is the man was being very foolish because he was not being generous, he was being selfish. Now, this whole thing fits into a statement that was proposed to Jesus before the parable. A man had come to him and said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So as we see parables, sometimes it's helpful to look at the context around the parables. Now, not every parable in each gospel has proper context, but in this case, we can see that Jesus tells this parable because a man is so concerned about possessions in this life that Jesus then wants to show just how fleeting possessions are and how we need to be on our guard against any kind of greed, that it's better to be generous and to just forgive people for any wrongs they've done to us. So as we look at exegesis in the parables, it's important that we identify characters and who they might represent, determine the main point, because that's why Jesus is telling it, rather than trying to allegorize every little detail. Study dialogue, because it will emphasize that main point. And then look for Jesus to conclude it in a way that takes the illustrative story and drives the point home. He's now no longer talking about a random man. He says this is how it will be for any of you. So he's driving the point back to his audience, and his audience is actually us today as well. And then look for that unexpected twist or surprise. Now, certainly a good one is the Good Samaritan, where the priest and the Levite, they're in the crowd and they're expected to be the ones that will help this man, and they all hate the Samaritan. So when Jesus says it's the Samaritan that helps, that really strikes home as what a twist in the story. Well, now that we've looked at exegesis in the parables, let's try to look at some quick hermeneutics for parables so that we can understand what we should be getting out of each of these. For our hermeneutic, we need to first remember that the parables were usually easily understood by their first century audience, but are often difficult for us today. His audience was very familiar with working yeast into dough, and we know that today too, but they would have known it. And they would also have known the size of a mustard seed because they planted mustard seeds. I don't know the size of a mustard seed. They also would have known how big a mustard seed grows when the plant is planted and the birds begin to flock into its branches. I don't know that just from my own experience. So these are things that I would need to study in order to properly pull out points from the parable. Maybe a mustard seed is small and it grows into a small plant. Well, Jesus is saying that this is like the kingdom of heaven. But a mustard seed is very tiny and it grows into a big garden plant. So he's talking about the expansion of the kingdom, as well as that little bit of yeast that works its way into a dough. If we don't understand the principle of how yeast can work into dough, then we miss the point of the parable. Number 2, apply the meaning of the central truth of the parable today. Let's say the parable is about forgiveness, like the unmerciful servant. He refuses to forgive the debt even though the debt's been forgiven him, and then God ends up telling the story that his perspective is he's not going to forgive anyone who has not themselves forgiven. So the main point of that is forgiveness. Or humility, when he talks about the Pharisee and the tax collector, and the Pharisee boasts before God, saying, "I fast twice a week." And the tax collector stands at a distance and beats his chest and says, "God, forgive me, a sinner. I'm not worthy of being in front of you." And Jesus says, "I tell you that that man, rather than the Pharisee, was justified before God that day." So let's understand the broader central truth of humility before God. Self-righteousness. We see it again in that same parable, and then we also see it in other parables that are usually the Pharisees. Take, for example, the prodigal son. The one who remains at the house says, "I always served you. I've never left you." And he's got this self-righteousness about him. Intolerance. Certainly in the parable of the Good Samaritan, there was such an intolerance toward the Samaritans, and the man wanted to justify himself as to, who is my neighbor? I'm following the law, and yet he was intolerant toward many people. And finally, persistence is one of the main truths in parables. We see that in the parable of the persistent widow. She's got an unjust judge, and she just always continues to persist, and she finally gets what she wants. And Jesus says, "I tell you, just always continue in prayer, and never give up. So we see some central truths in the parables, and as you look at each individual parable, try to pull out that main point, because that's likely why Jesus was telling the story, and then apply it to yourself. Number 3, don't make a parable say what it was never intended to say. In Luke chapter 13, Jesus talks about a parable of a man who continues to look for fruit on a tree. He doesn't find any, and he tells his servant, cut it down. And the servant says, sir, let me dig around it and water it, and hopefully it will grow. And if it doesn't, well, then you can come and cut it down. Now, the point of the parable is really not to give us this doctrinal argument between Calvinism and Arminianism of you can fall after being a Christian, or no, God's always going to hold on to you and you could never fall. That's really not what the purpose of the parable was there for, and we shouldn't try to make it say what it wasn't intended to say. Certainly we shouldn't over-allegorize the parables, as we saw that Augustine did with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And then number 4, retell the parable in a similar situation in our own culture. We saw an example of that in the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. He retold the parable of the Good Samaritan to his congregation and put in a pastor as well as an atheist, so that it actually made more sense to his audience and would just hit home with them. So we've covered our parables in depth, and now I want to give you some time to look at them some more. This concludes session 2, and we'll pick up again with session 3 in a little bit.